Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. I am Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and if you are watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. I am, of course, always excited for a great conversation here, and I have got two of my favorite That's Comical colleagues, even though I pretty much classify everybody as our colleagues here as my favorites. But Andy and Cammie are here. Andy, Cammie, pleasure to have you guys today.
Hey, Steve. Hey, everybody.
Hi guys, pleasure to be here.
So we are going to be doing a segment on our channel that we haven't done in quite some time. And I think the last time we did it, it was just the three of us. Hopefully Shay and April will join us for one of these in the future. But we're doing another Who Wore It Best. And I am just going to probably let Cammie take the reins right now, just because of the fact that this is a specific topic that she has been dying, and I mean dying with a capital D, to finally talk about. And that, of course, is the graphic novel sensation and DC animated film, Superman Red Son. So, Cammie, just tell the people how excited you are. Clearly, you are even wearing the Superman Red Son shirt.
I am ready. Yes, I've been ready for this. And the reason for this, Steve, I think is because this really was my segue into the world of comics, taking me back to all the vintage titles that you and Andy talk about so often in your conversations. And there had been some conversations that the two of you had prior to us even embarking on this journey of That's Comical. And this one is one that you guys talked about. You had really you put it on a pedestal. And this was my second comic after having fully read Batman The Long Halloween. And this solidified it for me because how dark it is, the turn that it took, and it took it so quickly. And I wasn't ready for it. As a reader, a constant reader of horror, I don't think that I was ready to have the impact of what this was going to do to me as a comic reader. And I fell in love with it. And it really showed me what comics are capable of. So I have been so excited to talk to the two brains that are sitting with me today about this comic and how much I love it.
Well, color me flattered there, Cammie. Yeah, a Superman Red Son is one of those big stories that I had heard about when I had been in that period from my late teens up until 2019 when I wasn't reading comic books. It was one of those specific titles. When I heard about it, I said to myself, you know, this is going to be one of those titles that I really want to make sure that I get my hands on and read at some point, because it's an Elseworlds title. We recently talked about what may be the greatest Elseworlds title, possibly one of the greatest DC titles, and that, of course, is Kingdom Come. And you know, when I heard about what the concept of Red Son was, it definitely was interesting to me, because it's just one of those ideas that I'm sure not just the brainchild that wrote it, who is Mark Millar, and Mark Millar is one of the living legends in the comic book writing world right now. I mean, everybody appreciates what he does. Everyone reads what he puts out there. I think he is responsible, as of 2022, for one of the best comic titles that came out this year, and that, of course, was King of Spies, which is eventually going to be a streaming TV show. I advise everyone who can get their hands on King of Spies to read it, but when I found out that DC Animation was going to be tapping this title for an animated film and seeing the voice cast behind it, I was like, okay, I haven't read it yet, but but let me at least see the movie and just get a better understanding of what it's all about. And hopefully it will make me want to go back and read the source material, because I'm one of those firm believers, don't judge a book by its movie. The movie did it for me, and I ran and got those copies. I'm still shocked that I managed to find the original 3-issue first printings miniseries for the price that I paid for it, because that's a big in-demand book, and I'm glad, because they're both great. And we will, of course, go into those depths and, of course, decide what is better. So, Andy, give us a little bit of your background in regards to this title and you.
So this is a fairly new one for me. I picked this book up and read it for the first time much earlier this year. Steve, I got at the comic shop with you. I picked up a couple trade paperbacks that day. So I picked this one up because I knew kind of in conversations that we had that Red Sun was one that Cammy in particular really loved, and that odds were we were going to try to talk about on this channel at some point. So it felt like a good thing for me to actually own. So I grabbed it, read it. I watched the movie last night, and I reread the comic this morning. So I've read the comic twice, once in February, once this morning, and I've seen the movie once, and that was last night. And just so everybody knows my background with it, after I read it in February, I kind of played it a little coy with Steve when he was asking a little bit. I actually really disliked it.
Really?
But then the movie pleasantly surprised me. And then I think going into the comic with low expectations, because I had not liked it when I first read it, the comic this morning surprised me yet again, and I had a different relationship with it this time through. So I thought coming into this conversation after last night, I was going to have a slam dunk answer to the question, who wore it best? And it's a lot more complicated this morning than I thought it was going to be. So anyway, that's my background with it. I also should probably mention at this point that my degree is in political science and Russian studies. And that really impacted my take on the comic. And it still does, but it certainly did at my first reading months and months and months ago. So anyway, just giving people that background on me and that background with the comic itself. Yeah, so that's what I got.
I did not know that. As a matter of fact, another very interesting fun fact about Red Sun is another thing that got me to really think about Red Sun before I even saw the movie or even read the book. One of the big things that I did spot many, many years ago was the exclusive. I don't know where it is, or I don't even know how much it's worth, but there is a Superman Red Sun Funko Pop out there in the world. It was one of the earliest exclusives ever made. I personally would like to see a remastered version because I would love to have a Superman Red Sun in my collection. That one and a Superman from Kingdom Come, because outside of the iconic Superman look, I would probably think that the other two most recognizable and most beloved versions of Superman are Superman from Superman Red Sun and Superman from Kingdom Come. I might be wrong, but that's my only personal opinion. So I personally will say, before we really go into the breakdowns, I think that Superman Red Sun, as far as the film goes, may be one of the best DC animated films to have come out in the last 5 years. I've actually, every 10 years, been doing a countdown of my top 10 animated films from DC. And I'm always excited to see, out of all the new releases, because they really do crank out a lot of new releases every single year, is that list going to change? And I think that Superman Red Sun may be one of the best written. And I'm actually not surprised as to why, because this was a little nugget that I discovered when I was rewatching the film. And Andy, I don't even know if you noticed this, but the movie was written by J.M. DeMatteis.
I did not. I was a little taken aback during the credits how much I liked the film, so I was not paying close attention.
So I said to myself, no wonder it was that good, because when you get a great comic book writer that's not Mark Millar to adapt it, you got to give him credit. I mean, I know that J.M. DeMatteis is more well known for his work on Spider-Man. That's like his big iconic claim to fame, but really nice to see that DC gave him a chance to try a new project, especially one that was as impactful as Superman Red Sun was. So yeah, I will definitely say that seeing the movie finally gave me the incentive to read the book, and I'm glad that I did, because I really am excited to break down the similarities and the differences between these two, because there's a nice eclectic mix of similarities and differences that will make great discussions. But of course, at the end, I think it's going to be very exciting to see where we all stand in regards to which one is better. So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. And it's so interesting because of the fact that it's in the book, it starts right off as to when Superman is joining Stalin and starting to be the country's hero or savior, as you will. Whereas in the film, we actually see Superman as a child in post-World War II Russia, telling his friend Svetlana, who is clearly their adaptation of Lana Lang, and telling her that he has superpowers. And what was the big thing for me in regards to that comparison is we don't see Superman's origin or beginning until the last page of the third book. And I find that very interesting. And for my personal opinion, I think the way that it's done in each of those separate medias is exactly the way that it should be. Because what I really appreciated about how Superman Red Son ends is it really shows us that in the end, was Superman truly a ruthless dictator at the end of the day? Or was he really that iconic face that really wanted to save the world? And you see the innocence when he arrives on Earth. And in the beginning of the film, when Svetlana sees his powers, I also find it very interesting. And I give the writers of the movie a lot of credit, because one of the few things that is not in the book is Superman's real name. And I really appreciate the fact that they decided, well, what could we possibly name him? And Superman's name in the film is Mishka. And I kind of like that, because when you think of a Russian name like Mishka, you think of someone who is very kind, very good-hearted, and someone that people seem to have good feelings towards. So the fact that he is who he is at the beginning of that film, and I think another little fun fact is Tara Strong voices him at the beginning of the film. Love that. But what do you guys think? Do you agree or disagree with my perspective on how the humble beginnings of Superman in this alternative universe are?
It's interesting. This is probably a good place to talk about the difference in pacing between the two, because you got into a lot. I think you're very right, Steve. I think that the comic handles it correctly, the movie handles it correctly for the medium. I am partial to how the movie handled the opening and Superman's origin personally, because I felt that, at least in my first reading of the comic compared to my first viewing of the movie, I had a much firmer grounding in this is a Superman, maybe not Clark Kent, but this is a Superman who has that good heart and that willingness to do the right thing from the jump. And I know that in the comic we cover that too, but something about meeting him for the first time as an older, fully formed person who's already in a little bit of conflict, at least with Stalin, if not a lot of conflict, at least for a while. It positioned me in more of a place to be hurt by Superman's fall from grace in the movie than it did the comic. So I liked being able to see him as a child, to see him completely pure-hearted, not wanting to hurt anyone, really doing things for the protection of others, and specifically choosing not to use his powers for the protection of others as our introductory lens into what the story was about to be. I thought that was really impactful in the movie for the direction that the story went to go. I also think it was a lot more impactful than the end of issue 1, kind of meeting a childhood friend who didn't really mean anything at the time, but that recenters his decision to use his powers.
I had to cut you off there, Andy. I just had to cut you off there. I'm very glad that you brought that up, because I was going to add that. I agree 100%. The fact that we actually get the introduction of Svetlana at the very beginning only shows a much stronger bond between her and Superman as the story progresses.
Yes, it was more of, in the comics, it was more of like a fun twist. Oh, look, it's essentially Lana. Than in the movie, where it's kind of foundational to the character, and then we revisit the character, and it's part of a big moment for Superman which comes even still, I would argue, before the fall from grace. You know, it's a change in perspective, but it's a much more slow burn to Superman's fascism in the movie compared to the comic. In the comic, it feels like there's a fun little twist, and then by the time we start issue 2, we've got fascist Superman. And I really liked the pacing of the movie so much better for that reason, because it really showed the, you know, the way that slow burn corruption, the way that the best intentions can be tainted, the way that we can see someone who really is the Superman we know and love, and who's always trying to do the best he can with the powers he's given and the world he lives in, but watching him end up being a combination of tricked, a combination of wrong, a combination of not being able to understand the people who disagree with him might be more right in this instance. So in terms of the origin, and I use origin loosely because I'm not just talking about the very beginning of the story, I'm really talking about the burn to fascist Superman here. The comic just feels like we got to just do it. The comic to me just felt like that's the fastest thing in the story, that we needed to flip that switch in order for issues 2 and 3 to be interesting. And the movie, I felt like we had a very morally complex Superman for a very long time.
We're going to get into
so I don't want to
later.
go too off the rails because that's a very bird's eye view, but I want to focus it just on the origin part of it. So going back to that, strongly preferred how the movie handled that. I think it was done really elegantly, and I think that they used the medium to the benefit of the pacing superior to the comic book with this one point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my take.
Well, I actually watched the movie before I read the comic because Steve and I had actually discussed Superman Red Sun for the DC animated live show that we do. And so that was my introduction to the whole thing there. And then like I said, I was in the process of doing, or had just come off of Batman The Long Halloween. And so I said, well, now it's time to read the comic. So I had already been subjected to the visual production of what this comic book would look like. So sometimes that works because I like to use, it's just like books and movies, you like to go in kind of with your own imagination so you can have your own take on it, and then later watch the movie so that way you can see someone else's interpretation. So for me going in, I was a little bit nervous and apprehensive, but they are two very different mediums. And I say this to people a lot, in terms of comparing books to movies. Don't always judge a book by its movie and vice versa, because you never know what you're going to get. You're up to the interpretation of how somebody else had viewed that or felt that or sensed it. And so having watched the movie first, I do very much appreciate how the movie lays it out. I do feel that we get a much more flushed out Superman and a story in general. But you can't compare oranges to apples because the illustrations in the comic are just mesmerizing. I think it tells us a story all its own, but I do think that you get a more clear definition of Superman and his intent, and you do start to build this love-hate relationship with him visually watching it come to life, because parts of you want to believe that there's good in him, parts of you want to believe that he is not this atrocious fascist monster. And then you're constantly at a battle of odds with yourself being an American, because you're only used to your red, white, and blue Superman. You're only used to the good that is, that is brought on by that red cape and what he's capable of. And then to see the other side of that, I think that's why I fell in love with it so deeply, because I am such a horror aficionado. I saw that comics could inherently be very dark and they could take on very dark subject matter. And I was quite frankly very nervous going in, and I'm like, oh shit, is that Stalin? Did he just shake Stalin's hand? So that really set it up for me, having no understanding of what the comic book was, and then just to watch all of that kind of come to, you do see some bits of humanity, I think, in Superman in the visual versus the comic book. But I will always stand firm on my podium when I say don't compare oranges to apples in terms of the book to the movie. I think they both bring a lot to the table. And of course, we'll get into the movie, I know, a lot deeper, but I think that for the movie, it definitely brought a dimensional, a three-dimensional side to Superman, where the comic book kind of failed in areas.
Well, that's one of the more interesting things that makes Red Sun the impactful story that it is. And I know, especially in recent years, there's a lot of people that are always saying, why are people who are out there writing comics, why are they trying to make Superman into a villain? But the real question is, I don't necessarily feel that was Mark Millar's intent in this book, because when I read the book and when I watch the film, I don't necessarily look at Superman as a villain, because Superman has always been that entity that always had one major goal in mind, and that was to save humanity. That was Superman's overall goal in the entirety of his almost 90-year lifespan in comic books. I just appreciate Mark Millar saying, well, why can't we see him be this iconic figure, but in a different way? And, you know, one of the things that really has been going through my head as I've been thinking about this story, I'm curious as to why it took so long to create Superman in a way like this, because this is an idea that I personally feel anybody could have thought of. I mean, I also go back to a story like Flashpoint, like what would have happened if it was Bruce Wayne that died and not Thomas and Martha in that alley? And I think that Jeff Johns, who gave us that idea, gave us a very interesting take. But that's the way that I feel. I never looked at Superman in this story as a villain. And I don't know if you guys agree or disagree in regards to that.
I'm going to have to interject and disagree with you right there, because I truly saw him as a villain straight from the jump. And I think that it was Mark Millar's intent, because I think that by taking Superman out of America and putting him into a different environment, that gave him a different face. I think that, again, I go back to what I just said. As an American, we are used to our red, white, and blue Superman. We are used to the hero that saves the day. This, we knew the counter side of it. We knew what Stalin was at that point. We had the history books to prove it. We knew what he was capable of. Therefore, you cannot look at that visually or read it on the pages and not assume that Superman isn't inherently evil at that point, because of what Stalin's drive is, what his purpose was, what he did. And so therefore, no, I did not look at Superman as the good guy. I immediately saw him as the villain, but with potential to see what he was doing, and what he was doing was wrong. And so when he chose to murder Stalin and that took place, I said, okay, now we have a Superman that we can know and love, but is he going to continue this drive? Because as history has taught, it's taught us anything, and also being a constant reader of true crime, inherently when you lash over to the dark side, when you give in to your evil, when you succumb to that darkness that's in us all, you don't necessarily, even if you taste good, want good. You don't necessarily strive for that kind of path or that kind of journey. Not everyone who sees that inherently they can be good strive to be better. I mean, look at serial killers, you know, and I'm not going to name names because I don't like to glorify serial killers, but you have to understand how smart serial killers are, and they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing is wrong, but they want the notoriety. They want the glorification. So in this case, despite Superman knowing what Stalin was, even after his demise, he still knew that he was now the focal point of this evil. Is he going to turn it around? Is he going to do better? And in for a few minutes, you think, yeah, okay, maybe there's a possibility there. But there was so much inherent evil that surrounded him and so much chaos. The challenge that Superman had throughout this entire process was within himself. He was constantly in his mind thinking, I'm doing the greater good for humanity and for all humankind, and all I want is for the world to be a better, peaceful, perfect place. But we know as humans that doesn't exist. Now, again, going back to my comic book training, as I like to call it, I know that Superman isn't human. He's an alien. And so his mindset and my mindset aren't one and the same. They don't work like that. You know, Superman isn't going to think on a human level. But at some point, you watch the chaos unfold because he continually tries to fix his mistake, and by fixing the mistake he's making more mistakes. He's making the situation worse. You can't create a perfect world. Humans aren't perfect. We're not designed that way, and he doesn't understand that. And throughout the entire process up till the final scene, he didn't get that until there was destruction. I just think there is such a beauty in the realistic side of horror in this story, that there is a real difference in how the thought process goes and how we think as humans versus how things are really inherently designed on the other side of evil. And I never once saw Superman as the good guy. Never
Well,
once. Was there a slice of humanity in him? Sure. Was there a constant battle of morality? Sure. But no, he wasn't good.
Well, you brought up something that I need to specifically mention because it was a big difference in the book and the film. He didn't kill Stalin in the book.
Right.
Stalin
Right.
died on his own. So that's another place where I personally felt the movie might have one-upped the book a little bit, because
Yes.
when he murdered Stalin after what he saw, what he did, thanks to, again, Svetlana showing him that, and not just Svetlana, a young Bruce Wayne. And I also know that they did throw the young Bruce Wayne into the book a little bit as well, because of the fact that he saw that, and then he chose to kill Stalin in the film and say, well, now I am in control of my own destiny. How am I going to do it? Again, him killing Stalin, he sees what Stalin has been doing to the Russian people, and he says it's wrong. And then he decides, now I'm going to take the government that I've been following, I'm going to mold it into a way I believe is right, and I am going to spread it to the rest of the world as best I possibly can, because, and again, this is why I don't look at him as a villain, I want to make the world a better place.
So I want to respond to both things. So Steve, that was something I was going to say, which was, I agree that I liked how the movie handled that better, because I thought that was a very interesting pivot point for the character, that we gave Stalin's death to Superman in the movie, as opposed to it being something that happened to Superman in the comic.
Yeah, he just died of natural causes. He just dies. Stalin just dies of natural causes in the book.
I thought it was brilliant. And what I mean by happened to Superman is it's just an event in his life that he had. Anyway, I think that was a brilliant change. Cammie, I think I agree with everything you said with the comic version of the character. I think that there's a couple things about the movie version of the character that make me think of it differently. I think it's critically important to remember that a major break for the movie version of Superman is getting the classified information from Lois Lane about atrocities being committed by the Soviet government. Superman then has the whole scene where he flies in, discovers that the gulag has been covered in lead. So he has spent his entire life not being able to see this, even with all of his superpowers. So Stalin intentionally kept him in the dark, and they have that great conversation before Stalin is killed about, like, you know, these are things that need to be balanced, right? And it's like, you can't. He's like, it's great that you have this idealism, Superman. That's important. And honestly, I think this speaks to the understanding of the story with the history of the Soviet Union, which is revolution does have to come from a place of optimism and hope. So the only way that, and that's to say nothing about how the government ends up or the outcome of the revolution, but there's an idealism behind the myth of communism that I think the movie does a really great job of wanting to be like Superman as he was conceived of and raised up by Stalin and the Soviet government is the ideal that doesn't exist, that is sold about what the message of the Soviet Union was supposed to be. And then Stalin is the brutal reality of what it ended up being. And I think by hiding the horrible stuff that was going on from Superman successfully, it lets us have that turning point of the character where he really was pure. He really did want to use his powers for good. It's why he says things like, is there really nothing more than smiling on this podium and, waving to the people, the opening of the dam? Like, couldn't I be doing more? And it coming from there. And it's that they wanted him to be this perfect symbol. And who he is, and as we know Superman is, he can't stand idly by. So when he gets this information, he doesn't just toss it aside and continue being the symbol.
He gets down to the bottom of
it. And I think it's wonderful that we get the return to the Svetlana character, that she gets to be a part of that he gets to see a part of his like idealized past being bastardized in this way by Stalin and the brutal Soviet government. I think it's phenomenal that we got the introduction to the Batman character in that same scene. I think it works way better than the comic book. In the comic, I think I understand what you're saying fully, Cami.
I do too.
I think it's easy to see Superman as, if you don't want to say villain, as being inherently flawed from the get-go. I think in the movie, however, they really try their very best to show us the atrocities were hidden even from Superman's superhuman sight. And so I feel differently about Superman in the movie than I do in the comics. So anyway, that's just kind of a little wrinkle I wanted to point out, which probably is at top of my mind just because I consumed both versions of the story so recently.
I will personally say that, as someone who really appreciates both of these pieces of media with this one single story, I will still say that there are two things that the movie does so much better than the book. And I think you will see how it really drives my side of this conversation for the rest of the recording. I think that when it comes to comparing the two of them, Mark Millar's intentions with the book are to basically take as much of the Superman lore as he possibly could and put it into this world, because we see things like the building of the Fortress of Solitude. We see other specific characters in the book that we don't even see in the movie. I'm pretty certain that Barry Allen made a small appearance in the comic. And in the movie, we just see the story, but told more so from a world perspective and less from just, let's take every little bit of Superman's mythos and let's just turn it into what it would have been like if he fell out of the skies in the Soviet Union and not in Smallville, Kansas. That's where I think the film really makes those necessary changes and cuts back on a lot of stuff that we saw in the book for the purposes of just making it a more streamlined story. And the second thing is, one of the things that Cami actually said earlier was the fact that the animation really gives us an additional dimension to these characters. And you couldn't have a better way to explain that than an incredible core voice cast. I mean, Jason Isaacs, when I found out that he was going to be voicing Superman, I basically said to myself, okay, this is interesting. How's he going to do it? Wow. Amy Acker as Lois Lane, incredible. I think the best person in the voice cast for me personally is Dietrich Bader as Lex Luthor, because that's one of the other things that I personally will feel that when it comes to comparing the book and the film, that I personally feel maybe outside of one or two things, that's the one part of the story that didn't change in the film. Lex Luthor's role in the story and his relationship with his wife, Lois, which was a very brilliant thing that I think Mark Millar did. Like, was Lois Lane going to be in Superman's world in this alternative universe? Yes, but how? And I personally feel that Mark Millar making a real ballsy move and basically saying, let's have her as Lex Luthor's wife instead of Superman's love interest. Personally, I think that was a great idea.
The one thing I want to clarify there is, yes, it maintained in the comic and movie the fact that Lois and Lex were an item, but incredibly different context in both. So that the relationship exists in both. But I by the way, throughout this conversation, I'm talking myself back into the movie is far superior to the comic. I'm just going to let you guys know that that's how I'm feeling.
Okay, so I guess we can just stop everything and say we all agree that the movie's better than the book.
At least I do. But let me,
no, I do too.
Let me tell you, the thing about the movie that I love is they've got a positive relationship in the movie. In the comic, Lex is ignoring her. It's unclear why she likes him. There's a lot of friction there, all that stuff. In the movie, they are a disjointed power couple, and I love it.
No, it's great in the movie.
In the movie, she is with Lex as a great man who stands, in her eyes, accurately, shoulder to shoulder with her in the impact that they can have on the world. She has this connection to this media and this insight into how humans operate and connect with each other. And Lex is brilliant, and she values him for that. I also think that the Lex character is very interesting in the movie. I think in the comic, he's just the villain we've always kind of known him to be, but without Superman being as able to directly impact his path, because Superman has decided to be as hands-off as possible with the United States in both stories. But in the movie, I really genuinely think that Lex is doing things not just for his own self-aggrandization. I actually think there is a lot of care for the United States that
you
Lex
see
has
that, and you
version.
see that at the very end of the film and in the book when he does in fact get elected president, because he actually pulls America out of the chaos that it does have in both the book and the film. It's not depicted as we would like to see in the book or the film, but it's mentioned. Yeah. And I think that him actually becoming president, and that was really what struck a chord with me in the film and the book, because I go back to the Justice League Unlimited episodes when Lex is running for president of the United States, and the scenarios as to if he could have been president of the United States. Like, we never wanted Lex Luthor to become president of the United States as comic book fans. But in this case, that's where I want to continue this conversation. Is Lex Luthor the villain in this story, or is he a hero, or is he even an anti-hero?
I don't know if I need to start this with you guys need to read more horror, or I need to read less horror, because apparently I'm very cynical. Because you guys are pulling out all these positive attributes of both Superman and now Lex Luthor, and I saw the relationship between Lex and Lois completely volatile and very toxic right from the start, both in the movie and in the comic. I think the way he treated her was just absolutely atrocious. I think the type of behavior that she accepted and deemed acceptable was atrocious. I think normalizing those types of narcissistic relationships in any form of media is atrocious. And I think maybe as a female, I kind of get empowered because I have dated a narcissist in the past. It really just boils my blood. And to see someone as smart as Lois be treated that way and just kind of be dismissive of things that are important to females, like your anniversary and your birthday, and just milestones of being in a relationship, being recognized, being merited, even just being noticed, it is bothersome to me. So there was no point of that relationship that I thought it was okay. I think that Lois got to a point where she tolerated it because she felt that she had no other options. When she's asked in the movie, kind of, she's not even asked, she just kind of volunteers the answer, why do I put up with this, and she gives her top 3 reasons. I think those are excuses. I think those are reasons for her to validate the way she's feeling and suppressing her feelings further. She could do so much better than Lex Luthor. Furthermore, the horror lover in me does love Lex Luthor in a lot of ways. I think that he's extremely intelligent. I think that he offers a lot to America, but do I find him anything less than a villain? Absolutely not. And maybe you guys need to read more horror, maybe I need to read less, because there are a ton of times where I find myself applauding the villain in some of the, just horrific things that I read. And then I have to have a moral, impasse with myself. Like, who are you? Why are you rooting for the villain? Why is this okay? This is not okay. What is wrong with you? Go get some fresh air and some sunshine, But in this particular case, you do see some human elements to Lex that kind of give you the illusion that he wants what's best for America. But again, that goes back to what I said very early on, and I will stand by it, that Superman is indeed a villain as well. Because when you compare two things, when you have a good and an evil in whether it be a comic book or whether it be in a movie, you find yourself doing a comparison contrast like that. And when you put the bad guy up against the good guy, you kind of elevate the good guy because the bad guy is so horrible. But when you have two guys that are kind of equal presence, you find that you're just asking yourself, okay, well, who is the greater evil here? It's kind of like when Hillary ran against Donald Trump, who's the greater evil that I want to vote for here? It's one of the things that, for me, as a true appreciator of the dark that comics can be, to me, there is no true good guy in this particular story. There are good elements to bad guys, but I don't see Lex Luthor as a good guy. I see that he was a bad guy who was very self-involved, very selfish and self-driven. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's just who he is, but he doesn't need to drag Lois down with him. A man like that needs to stand alone. A man like that should not be married. He should just continue being who he is, so that way all his selfish behavior and tactics don't affect other people. Because there is a human element to Lois Lane. She is not a villain. She is a reporter. She is a woman. She is strong, smart, articulate. And these are, I think, things that kind of went to the wayside in this story. None of that was really brought to the forefront. And then, furthermore, we have a different side of Superman in this story where he's not our Superman. He's the Soviet Union Superman. And did he do good things? In the end, maybe. But it was little seen, unknown, and known too late, and the damage had already been done.
Yeah.
You can look back on any evil person in our history and you can say, oh, but they did this. Well, that's great, but look at all the bad that they did.
Yeah, I will agree with you in certain ways, Cammie.
I'm not a fan of anybody being the good guy in this story. I think that the beauty that Mark Millar created here was an allowance for us to be able to view these characters in a different way, in a different light, and see that inherently we're not supposed to see these guys as the good guy. There's not a light on the end of the tunnel. It's more of this is an alternate tomorrowverse. This is potentially what could have happened if Superman had landed in Russia versus in America. And instead of growing up as a wholesome farm boy, he grew up in the hands of, Nazis. And in the event, this is what transpired. We have a much darker world that we live in there. And I think there's a beauty to that too, though, because we are so accustomed to going through some kind of tragic, dark event, whether it be in book form or movie form. And then at the end, the good guy always prevails. And then we go on to rainbows and sunshine. Well, here, yes, do we have a promise of a better tomorrow? But we don't necessarily see it. There's a lot of mayhem and destruction that are still behind us, and we don't know what it's going to look like. But at least we have kind of a visualization that it's not the darkness that it was. But I don't really give credit to Superman here either. He just realized that a lot of the choices that he made were wrong for humans.
Okay, so let me throw a couple of scenarios out here and give me your thoughts, because to a certain degree, I see, trust me, Cammie, I see where you're coming from. And yes, I looked at both of them not as heroes or villains, but I looked at them as, like Andy says, complex characters. Because if I'm wrong, Andy, because I know you just read it recently, so it's really fresh in your mind, catch me if I'm wrong when I start this rant here. So the scene in the book and the movie where the satellite falls on the United States, as far as I'm concerned, it was not manipulated to fall in Metropolis in the book, and yet Superman flies from communist Soviet Union to Metropolis to stop the satellite. To
So
show
you're wrong.
I,
Just so you know, in a very different way. In the comic, it was manipulated by Lex Luthor.
so it also was manipulated in the comic as in the film. I just wanted
Yeah.
to double check that.
In the film, it is implied that it was done by the Soviet government as a show of strength. So the two, it's the first chess piece move by Lex in the comic, and it is a show of strength by the Soviets in the movie.
No, that's what I
think
want to
I've
make
got
sure
that
of.
right. I did watch both stories. Now I'm just afraid that I'm mixing them up because it is intentionally a subtle detail in both places because it's supposed to be a first move that, and its goal is the same in both places. Superman is shown to be someone who cares about people of the whole world, but the thing that the match is different in both. Anyway, go ahead,
because in the movie, I do remember distinctly being manipulated by Lex Luthor. Why? To get Superman's DNA and make Superior Man. And let me also say, I am very glad that they changed the name to Superior Man and didn't call him Superman 2 like they did in the book. I thought that was very, very stupid. But here's the one thing that I really did not like about the film. I didn't like the fact that they roped in modern day politics. When Superior Man yells America first, I got really pissed off. I really did.
The comic was not political?
Well, I didn't like this specific thing. They didn't need to do that.
I thought they did. And it's because the comic was released in 2003 during the Bush administration, and the movie came out in 2020 at the tail end of the Trump administration.
I know.
I think that this story is intensely political.
Oh, yes, it is.
And I think both are written in the context of the politics of their time. So something I want to say. So Cammie, I have so much in my mind. I agree with so much of what you said, so I should clarify my own position here. It's definitely not a story to cleanly use the terms heroes and villains. I don't think. I don't want it to be read. I think that Lex is infinitely more redeemable in the movie compared to the comic. I think he is completely irredeemable in the comic. I think that the movie did a better job of making both characters more morally complex than their comic version. I think both comic versions of the characters are completely inexcusable. And I think Superman actually needed to die in both stories. And I think it was a mistake to not have Superman die in either story. I think the closest they came to that is him making the decision not to use his powers anymore, seemingly, in both stories. But I still think that was a narrative misstep. I think he actually needed to die. In the movie, I think he might have actually been redeemed on some level if that happened. In the comic, it was irredeemable. He just still needed to die. Anyway, so I think that I'm really curious how I would have felt about this if I had seen the movie before the comic. Because I think that I view Lex and Lois's relationship so differently because it's so much worse in the comic.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it's that I went into the movie expecting for it to be similarly atrocious.
Yeah.
And in the movie, it was much more nuanced, is really the way I want to say it.
I
in
think
the
really
comic,
what it is. No, wait, am I wrong? Did Lois try to serve him divorce papers in the comic? For some strange reason, I'm reminded of that. I don't know why.
I don't remember that scene, and I read it this morning.
I think the funny thing is, in the movie, I think it's just because of the fact that Lois is no better than Lex, because Lois just loves the power that she has.
No, but in the movie, Lois has so much more agency because Lois is directly involved in Superman opening his eyes to the Soviet government, whereas in the comic, she's more along for the ride. So I really like the movie version of Lois for that reason. And I think part of the reason why I see their relationship in the movie as not being completely terrible is because I had the context of the comic first, where the comic, it's like, Jesus Christ. So anyway, I think similarly to how I'm talking about the characters, like I don't want to use the like morally black and white terms, hero and villain here. I should do the same thing with the relationship. I'm not saying they had a good relationship in the movie. I'm saying they have a far more interesting relationship in the movie. And I think it's one that lets Lois show her agency. Also, something I really want to talk about, and this is putting on my my Russian studies hat for a second here. I want to clarify something that you had said, Cami, about how Superman was raised in the story. And I think it's really important to remember, first off, I'll just clarify, all Nazis are fascists, not all fascists are Nazis. So the Soviet government was fascist. The Soviet people, there's a lot more complexity there. And I think that the movie does a good job with that, because it's what we have to remember is Superman in this story is a symbol for what the Soviet government came into power on and claimed to be, even though it wasn't. I think there's a really interesting, and this has to be political because it's a very political story. I think there's a very interesting parallel on the United States side, because I think Superman, and I might as well throw out here Captain America, the reason these characters work is that they are the embodiment of what the ideal is supposed to be. The governments fall far short of that much more often than they achieve that goal. But in these characters who are trying to do their best, we see the dream embodied. So I want to say that I don't think that Superman in the movie or the comic was raised by fascists. I think the family that held on to him and grew him first are, how Superman turned out and the way that his story was tragic, needed to be joyous believers and also wanting the best. I think we see that in the beginning of the movie with Superman not wanting to hurt, regular humans that he knew he could do big damage to. Mm-hmm. And I do think we see it in the comic with him, really driving through, I want to protect people. I think it's more artfully done in the movie, but I think the reason that he even has that core of like, I'm not doing this for control, and the reason he thinks that America is going to fail on its own is very that internalized ideal of the dream. It's the decision that it's the idea that capitalism eats itself, which is what he grew up with, which is why Superman, even seeing people dying in the United States, doesn't go in, because he says to Brainiac, yes, look, that's unacceptable to kill 6.5 million people in order to bring them a utopian government, because capitalism eats itself. So all I have to do is sit here and take care of the people I have. And he falls far short of it. But you can see the bastardization of the ideal that he holds. And I think that was really well done, particularly in the movie. I think that was well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, and again, it goes back to, I don't want to just use the morally unambiguous terms hero and villain, but I do think he was a whole lot more complex in the movie, particularly because he gets to live that ideal until it is thrust upon his shoulders at the moment where he realizes, I have to kill Stalin, because Stalin is not the ideal. I have to kill him. Yeah. And then everything just starts to snowball from there. He handles everything wrong. And also, I should say, we haven't talked at all about Batman.
Well,
Batman
I was going to wait until you were done
in the movie.
I was going to wait until you were done because I was going to go into the next thing.
But so I'll pivot. I think that's where I'll pivot and start to hand it off if that's where you'd like to go next, because I also think Batman was far better done in the movie.
So, Cami, unless you want to talk about Batman, is there anything else you want to say before we go into the next topic?
No, I was just gonna continue to piggyback off what he was saying about it being very political, and then also just preface I don't know if you guys had the version where Tom DeSanto had kind of broken down his background on Mark Millar and the story, but I think that's very important if this is your first time coming into reading the comic, to read that and his thoughts, because he really does kind of encompass in a very articulate way everything that we're all kind of saying here. And he does also justify that Mark Millar is in a very gray area. And I think that in a way, being the comic book enthusiast that we are and having read so many great stories, we're trying to find the silver lining, and we're trying to put forefront the good that is in this story, which is great because that just shows that we're good human beings. But I think it is important to point out how political comic books can be, and I think that our heroes, you see it a lot. We saw it in Kingdom Come, we see it here in Red Sun, and I think that as we age and as we ourselves are more involved in the world around us, and we're now taxpayers, and we're doing all these things which really drive our vision of the political realm around us, we start to kind of I guess incorporate it into what we read. And these are supposed to be an escape, but you can't escape reality. And I think, you know, with what you had said a while back, Steve, you know, this isn't very political. No, it is very political.
No, guys, I think you took my entire statement out of context. I didn't say that Red Sun wasn't political. I just didn't like the fact that they took our current politics and put it into the story. I just didn't like the fact that they compared Superman to Donald Trump.
But that's what I'm saying. I think that that wasn't the intent. I mean, what Andy had said, this was written in 2003. I think that as modern day comic book readers, we take our political climate and we see it in the words that we're reading. It's not something that is written. It's not the intent. It's just how our brains work. It's media. That's how media is driven. We are such a technological society where images and words and billboards are thrown at us constantly, that we have a constant play of what's going on around us. And then we open up a comic book or turn on an animated movie and we try to escape, but we can't, because then we're starting to relate the words that we're reading to the world around us.
Okay.
I think honestly though, that's brilliant writing. That if Mark Millar can have written a story in 2003 and we're seeing similarities in our world today, and then even further, we haven't even really touched on this. Look at how much retro politics are in this. Look at how much, you know, we're seeing past presidents, we're seeing you know, little shades of Roswell and aliens and all these things. And that really sets the political climate for how we function today. So I think the writing and the way that does get your mind to think and connect it to today is brilliant, because that shows that this writing is truly timeless.
Well, yes. I mean, there were a lot of specific things that they did show in this world that I did find very interesting. Like, I loved the fact that Superman in the movie tore down the Berlin Wall the minute it just finished being constructed. I loved the fact that John F. Kennedy wasn't assassinated in the comics or the film, but they mentioned in the comic that Richard Nixon was.
Yeah.
I found that very interesting.
Yeah.
But there were some other things that, and now again, let's go into the rest of the characters, because we have characters like Batman, we have characters like Wonder Woman, we have Brainiac, which in my opinion is the true villain of this story. In my opinion, we have the United States / Earth version of the Green Lantern Corps. And the other thing that I personally, in regards to seeing modern day politics roped into this film, this is just my personal opinion, I didn't like the fact that they race swapped Jimmy. I never like when they race swap Jimmy. I never like it at all. And I'm pretty sure that we never got Wonder Woman's sexual orientation in the book. I don't think that was necessary.
I think that she had an implied interest in Superman in the comic.
She did.
And then they raised in, you know, back like in her homeland, they did raise same-sex attraction though. That wasn't completely changed. I will say her not having interest in Superman was changed, but I actually really loved the whole scene of what I really need is a friend. And it was really interesting to see Superman have someone that he saw as an equal like that. And I thought that conversation was actually really great.
This also isn't the first story
to race swap Jimmy, so I don't care about that.
It's a great conversation, but I personally just don't feel, again, it's just because of the fact that you're talking to someone here in the room that is sick and tired of identity politics and our jargon these days. I just hate it anymore. I'm done with it. I'm done with it.
Yes, but I think that it was very subtle, and who hasn't really thought about that? I mean, come on an island entirely made up of women, you can't in your mind at some point hasn't gone there.
I know, it's given. I agree with you. But I personally reminded myself when I was reading Red Sun in the comic version and reading Wonder Woman, it reminded me a lot of the relationship that Wonder Woman had with Superman in the Injustice comics.
Yes. And yeah. Sorry, Cammie, you look like you want to say something too. I mostly wanted to say, yes, it reminds me of that.
I personally love Wonder Woman in the Wonder Woman in the story. I really do.
I was just going to add on what I always tell Steve. I always have to sometimes smack him in the face when we're having these conversations, because you get so stuck in yesterday, and you need to remember that certain subtle hints of bringing us into today will bring more comic book enthusiasts into the new generation. You sometimes have to do that. And you have to remember, Steve, the comic book was written in 2003. The movie was created in 2020. That line was perfectly okay because it wasn't saturated. It wasn't overdone. It wasn't in your face. It was actually comical, and I enjoyed it. It was a nice little comic relief. And you can't be so set in your ways that you bring in nuances of, you know, our current societal climate and context and conversation, and not be, I mean, you don't have to be okay with it. I'm not saying that at all.
I'm not okay or not okay with it. I'm just tired of it.
No, and that's what I'm saying. I understand that. I understand that some people feel oversaturated with it, but this, I think, was very subtle. I think it was funny, and I don't think it was out of line. I think it's something, like I said, that we've all thought about, and I chuckled. I was just like, oh yeah, okay.
I got nothing to add, Cammy. That was based as fuck. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just snaps. I just agree. I will say, because now I'm thinking about Wonder Woman, and I do think it's really important to talk about Wonder Woman. I have a lot of trouble deciding how I feel about Wonder Woman and her role in the story in both versions after having reread the comic this morning, because I felt that in the movie, I was getting so mad at her for continually attempting to redeem a Superman who was far past redemption at every stage that she stepped in to help him. Right. And then when I read the comic, I was very pleased with how she didn't. Even though I feel that she had a bigger role and a more interesting part to play in the movie, but I was just so frustrated with her in the movie. So I really don't know how to talk about Wonder Woman's overarching narrative, other than to say, as with most great Superman, Batman stories, I feel like Wonder Woman always plays an important role. She's one of the big three. It's anytime she is in a story, as she is in that story with Superman and with Batman, the story is enriched. So the fact that I have a strong response in both forms of the story is a good thing. I just can't quite decide how I feel about the character in both places. I'm just really glad she was there, and I think she adds a layer of complexity in both places.
Well, I think the best thing about Batman in this story is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. I think that the movie gets him so much more right, and yet he is given to us less in the film than he is in the book. Yeah. And I find that very interesting.
And I really want to say, the part of the reason I loved the version of the movie character compared to the comic is, in the Batcave in the comic, he's got like American memorabilia, and I think it reduces the story to a run. His role is an attempt at a reduction to black and white morality between the United States and the Soviet Union that I think falls flat when put up against the rest of the story. In the movie, Batman is an anarchist through and through, and it's cool.
I love
because
it.
Because he's brutal. We get the addition of, I'm going to blow up this place in 10 minutes. He's like, did I say 10 minutes? I meant 10 seconds. It's brutal. It's different. It's hateful, but it's free, and it's great. In the comic, it's just a little bit too much like, I want to bring about an American style of freedom. Not that that's entirely what's said, but I think it's what it's implied by the existence of the Batcave, which I just think is not morally ambiguous enough to jive with the rest of the story, which is why the movie just gets it so right. The brutal anarchist Batman is just, that's great. And I know that he has the effect in the comic of being a martyr, and then it leads to the Batmen, and there's a lot of talk about what they are doing is kind of some grassroots uprising.
Very Dark Knight Returns to a certain degree.
Very Dark Knight Returns. But I just, and anyway, I could go on, but I think that the heart of what I want to say is there. The movie is done better because he's a brutal anarchist, and that is so much more interesting and so much more of a counterpoint to both Lex and Superman than it is in the comic. He's just kind of there in the comic, but in the movie, he's a force.
I just feel that the movie gives him a much better role because we see that even though he's not in the film predominantly, because clearly you see him as a young boy in this film. And I think that's one of the other really cool things I love about the book and the movie, but it's definitely done better in the movie, is you actually see Superman as a Kryptonian. He really does age slower than everybody else, because we have to remember the fact that in the comic books, Bruce is actually older than Clark.
Yeah.
And we keep forgetting the fact that in this story, Bruce is only a little boy when Superman is practically an adult. And the fact that we see him age and we see Lois age and Lex age, I love the fact that Lex starts with a full head of red hair, and at the end of the story, he is bald. I kind of love that.
Yeah.
And no, it's just like he does so little in this story in the film, but when his presence is on the screen, especially when he traps Superman by threatening to kill Wonder Woman, I just think that the movie handles it so much more brilliantly. And then when Batman's gone, it's like you feel for the guy. He was an anarchist, and he had the same intentions in the book as he did in the movie, but he was doing it in a completely different way, and it was to liberate the Soviet Union from Superman.
Yes.
But it's done much better in the film.
So much better, so much more interesting, so much better.
That also goes to show you just how progressive we've become as a society, because I think that Mark Millar probably would have tried to be a little bit more anarchist with Batman and his character, but I don't think it was socially acceptable in 2003. I think we've come a long way in, nearly 20 years. I think that's why the movie for me does it so brilliantly, because it does bring out a lot more of the darker elements. It brings it to light, and it really does showcase that you can truly have a villainous villain. And I think that, going back to what Andy had said, I think I was trying so hard to do the hero villain kind of story arc here, and it really isn't here. This is a very gray area. We're seeing a lot of dark elements to a lot of characters that we love, and either you love it or you hate it. Either you absorb it and eat it with a spoon, or you just say, this one isn't for me. And I think that, for what it's done and how far we've come, and the cool element for me as both a reader and a animation watcher is to see how far we've come since 2003, that we're able to take a story that's a bit dated and bring it to life on the big screen, not ruin the story, but add those subtle little nuances that kind of bring it into our current reality and things that we can relate to without rewriting the story or changing the characters in any such way that it's detrimental to the original writing. So yeah, there's a lot of beauty to be said in how far we've come as a society. There's a lot of craziness too, don't get me wrong. I mean, there is still that moral compass that lies within me, but I can appreciate the fact that we have overcome a lot of things, and we're willing to tackle more things head on and not be afraid that we are going to offend people. Change doesn't happen by not offending people.
Yeah, I also have to say one little thing, because I got to throw my fanboy in here to a certain degree. There was one little thing from a historic standpoint that I would have loved to see take place in this film or book and see how they would have handled it. I was actually really surprised that not a single thing was mentioned about Cuba. I would have been very interested to see how Superman would have handled 1963 with the Bay of Pigs, because I like the fact that in the movie he said, I figured that if Kennedy was elected president, that America would actually join us. So I'm just like saying, what's
interesting. We got Korea in the movie. That's interesting. We got Korea. We didn't get Cuba in either place. That's really interesting. I'm glad you said that. Cammy, I also want to say I think you're entirely right. And the one thing I want to say is I do think that the message of both of these stories is the same. I think that there's a different coat of paint on it, in that one was written in response to the Bush administration and one was written in response to the Trump administration. But I think that the core of the story, again, no heroes, no villains, but Batman is right in both of them. He's brutal and he's not to be deified, which is a funny thing to say when he intentionally martyrs himself. But the message of the story seems to be that the extreme, the fascism, no. And the thing that we get from Superman deciding not to use his powers, again, I think it would have been better if Superman died. But the thing that we get in Superman choosing to not use his powers, and the way we end the story is on let the humans do what the humans do, I think is actually a version of saying Batman was right. That the anarchy of it, that the tearing down of, because and this is why I like the movie version of Batman better. He's not deifying America in the movie version.
That's correct.
What Batman really wants to tear down is fascism and the inability for people to be the captains of their own ship. It might not always be pretty, but it's preferable. And Batman understands that in a way that Lex can't, because Lex is kind of that Randian, unbridled capitalism Superman, and Superman can't, because Superman is, I have all this power, I want what's best for everybody, let me just get them in my little bubble, literally in some cases, so that I can, curate this and be the great gardener. And so I think that at the end of the day, just to put a button on things, I do think the message that we're meant to come away with a little bit of a different flavor in both stories, but on the whole, is that Batman might not have been God himself incarnate, like deified, look at me, morally, correct in all stances, but his position is what is being put forward as the morally preferable position. I found that interesting, and I found it much more artful in the movie than I did in the comic.
Yeah, speaking of artful, there's another thing that I think the movie does much better than the book, and that's Superman's evolution through the years. And that is, as we go through the decades, we notice the costume that Superman is wearing dramatically changes throughout the years, because he doesn't seem to realize that he is becoming, as the decades go on, more and more like the man, Joseph Stalin, who basically adopted him as his son/savior of the Soviet Union. You see that it starts to look less like a symbol of hope with the logo and the cape and just like the spandex, to it actually looks like a Soviet Union uniform. It's so interesting. And you also notice that the more that he starts to evolve as this fascist leader, the less friends he suddenly sees around him. I think one of the most powerful things in the movie that's not in the book is when he's sitting down with the leader of the People's Republic of China. And he basically is trying to say to him, and like, notice that they're in that dinner scene, how they're on complete opposite sides of the table, and how Superman is trying to see, like, are we actually friends? And then the leader just flat out says, "You terrify me."
Yeah. That's very, very, very true. And I think that's the tragedy. That's the tragedy of the Superman character. And I think the difference in the flavor of anti-hero /villain /whatever between Lex and Superman in this is there is deep tragedy to Superman's story, because, as particularly in the movie, we see where he started. We see Svetlana's faith that one day I knew you were going to come. I'm glad I got to see this sunrise, but like, I knew that you would be here because I know who you are. And we never lose. Well, also, it's that we know who Superman can be, because this is not the only Superman story in existence. And so it's tragic, because Superman is can be the greatest among us. He can err. He cannot be perfect, but he is someone with at his core with a good heart. And so it's tragic. And I think you're exactly right with his interpersonal ties and watching them deteriorate, the loneliness at the certain point where Brainiac is the only person he speaks to. Yeah, it's tragic.
So the other way that the United States tries to stop Superman's Soviet rule is by creating the Green Lantern Corps for the United States. And I think the movie does it so much better because we also see Lex's intentions. Because even though we've had that conversation about him before, but I want to go and support what Cammie said earlier today, because that scene in the movie is so much more of a giving us an understanding of Lex as a character and his intentions, is when he sees Abin's sword on that table and he just cuts the finger off and takes off the ring. I love that scene. But
what a great scene.
But what we get from that, we get so much more in the movie than we do in the book, because I love that we see Guy Gardner. I love that we see Jon Stewart, and not just Jon Stewart, but Phil Lamar returns to voice Jon Stewart as one of the Green Lanterns. I just love that scene in the movie. It's so much better than in the book. Even though I love the fact that it's in the book. I really, really do. But it's just like when you see things like Superior Man, who to a certain degree, which I didn't say earlier, Superior Man to a certain degree at the end sort of becomes Bizarro.
Yeah,
based on
in
how
the
he
comic that's
deteriorates.
explicit. They even say Bizarro in the comic, but they certainly never say it in the movie. It's
And
more
they
of
also,
like
and
a
that's
reference.
another thing. They also have a lot of Superman's rogues gallery under the leadership of Lex Luthor going after him, like Metallo and Parasite and all of that stuff. I'm so sorry that I forgot to mention that. But then we also have Brainiac in the story. And as far as I'm concerned, Brainiac is the villain, because that's where I started looking at Superman, not necessarily as a hardcore villain at the end of both stories, because at the end of the day, was this really Superman being his true self, or was he being manipulated? That's the way that I look at it. I think that to a certain degree, Brainiac was the one who was truly in control of the Soviet Union before Superman realized it. That's just my own
Superman
thoughts.
still had to be tricked by that successfully, and he was. So while
it was
Brainiac
the second
was
time
a
he
devil
got tricked too.
Yeah, well, yeah, but since Brainiac was an additional devil on his shoulder, you know, Brainiac played a lot of, I think Brainiac is unambiguously evil in this story. But I do think that Superman still bears moral responsibility. I don't think that the devil whispering in your ear absolves you of listening to the devil. They do a great job of Brainiac being like, I could not allow you to speak to a level 9 intelligence for too long, otherwise things would change. And then it's like, I'm a level 12 intelligence. You've been speaking to me for 20 years at this point. But I think you're right. But I just want to add that twist there, because it does not absolve Superman of anything. That's all I want to say.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
I think you do. I know you do. I just wanted to clarify that, because I didn't want it to come across like we're like, oh, actually, forgive Superman. It was Brainiac's fault, because Superman still has agency. He's Superman, and it's not like he falls to Brainiac in other media. So, you know.
Before Cammie, before you jump in, I just want to say one specific thing as a compliment to the both of you. These are two people that I constantly talk politics with. And let me just say that I am just so glad that we are having this conversation, because Andy and I, we had an amazing conversation the last time we got together. Cammie, you and I always have an amazing political conversation. So it's really nice that we are actually able to rope our political knowledge and know-how into something like comic books that we truly love. So Cammie,
especially
please.
This one. It's pretty overt
absolutely.
Here, but sorry.
Absolutely.
Kind of just what Andy was saying, I just wanted to remind us of that moment where, you know, Lois and Superman are having that conversation about the bottled city of Starling, and when she's standing there and he's, you know, kind of Brainiac's in the back, and he's saying, no, you had the power to change this all along. They did not have to be in this state. And I think that's the first time that he actually realizes, oh my God, I did have the power all along, and never once did I ask that this go back, you know, the way that it could be, and release
that's only
these people
in the
from
movie,
their
by the way.
Yeah,
I just want to remind people that's, but you know, Cammie, you're right, and I agree with you completely. I just wanted to do asterisk in the movie version, which is yet another thing that I think the movie does better, because I think that's a very nice twist there, and shifting to Superman's shoulders, exactly what we're talking about, some moral responsibility falling back on him. You are entirely correct. You are entirely correct, right? Those the two words I put together
Good job.
in the
You made a
movie,
new word.
which is again the superior version of this story. So,
To the Webster's Dictionary, pronto.
yeah.
No, but no, you're absolutely right. And I love that. That's why we have these conversations, because you guys always interject with the truth of the, hold on, let me get down to the core of the comic for you and fix that. Because I go off on my rants and I forget to depict, oh wait, that was the movie, that was the comic. But no, I think that also, I really didn't talk about the Batman element at all. I didn't interject in that part, but I think that's why Batman was so important in this story, is because we oftentimes forget that a lot of these characters that we are integrated with are not humans, and we try to humanize them because to us they are humans. And Batman is very much a human being, and to see a darker side of Batman to me is not alarming, because Batman comes from a very tragic, dark past.
Correct.
And when he elevates that darkness, it's like, yeah, okay, now Bruce is here. Now we get the real Batman. And to see him go head to head with, our version of Superman on the other side of the tracks is a real reality for us in terms of this story and how it lays out. Because oftentimes, what Andy was saying, we know how good he can be, and the whole time we're kind of in a way rooting for that little sliver of goodness that we know is within him, like Svetlana did as well. I know you're good, I know that you have the capability of being good, but yet we watch him transcend and march into darkness and inevitably become this darker version of what he was trying so hard to fight, because in his mind he is doing the right thing. And it's a true testament to humanity also, about how we always think that the mission or the drive that we're on, we're so focused on what we think is right and what we think is good for the greater good of all that are around us. And sometimes we have such blinders on because what we're doing is actually causing more damage than good. And so there's a lot of beauty in comics if we just kind of stop and even just peel away the layers sometimes about what humanity is, what humans are, what's going on in our world, how we interact with each other, the capabilities that we have as human beings if we just got along and we set war aside and we set our differences aside and we just listen to each other. And then when you pile up all these things and all this ego and all these missions and drives, then you get a story like what we have here with Red Sun, where the whole time he's thinking he's doing good and he's really destroying us as humans. He's trying to help us and he's not. He's killing us. And inevitably that's what we see.
So then we get the two-pronged ending, which is after the final showdown with Brainiac. Basically, Superman is pretty much beaten in the book to a letter that Lois hands him from Lex. And that exact same thing in the letter is actually mentioned to him by Lois, but it's not in the form of a letter. And the truth of the matter is, I kind of love how Lex beats Superman at the end, just by telling him, you just want to put the whole world in a bottle. And I kind of found that so powerful. And it reminded me a lot of Superman's mythos, because going back to what Superman is as an iconic figure in the comics and overall in popular culture, he is an alien that came to this world, and all he wants to do is he wants to keep the world safe. But the one thing that he always realizes, even though, and I think that's one of the main reasons why he is the icon that he is, that he knows that no matter how hard he tries, he is never going to truly save the world, but he is going to keep trying it till his dying breath. And that's one of the main reasons why I just love him in this depiction or in any depiction, because in the end, that's his true intention. And that's one of the other things I really give credit to Mark Millar for when he wrote this book, because that's what's, in the end, regardless of whether he was a fascist dictator in the Soviet Union or if he was a superhero in the United States, he still has that heart and he still says, I need to save everybody.
I also think that this is great because you're right about his intent and his will to save everybody, and that's in this story, that's the perfect kind of capstone. You want to put the world in a bubble, all that. I feel like people ask the question all the time. Diehard comic fans, you know, new comic fans, people who have just seen a movie, people who are just aware of the character. Like, if Superman is all powerful, why doesn't he X? If Superman is all powerful, why doesn't he Y? It would, you know, put everything in place. Well, then simultaneously, we have people asking, oh man, why do people keep doing Superman as a dictator stories? Well, if people would stop asking, why doesn't Superman just act as a fascist, then we would stop getting Superman as a dictator stories. Because I think this is the answer to that question. The thing is, when Superman takes the world literally in his hands and puts it in a bubble, he's not a hero. He's a villain. And that's what these stories are really good at showing. I say these stories in the context that we've also talked about Injustice.
We're currently seeing that in the comics right now by who? Who is saying that now? His own son.
Yeah, exactly.
His son is now even questioning him.
But that's the thing. And I think this story, it's good because whereas the trope at this point of Superman as a fascist, of Superman as a dictator, is the answer to that question, which is why, again, I think he should have died, but his decision to not use his powers at all, probably not the fully right decision. The right thing to do is the hero Superman that we know from other stories. But you can see it's that absolute power corrupts absolutely is kind of the message of these Superman as dictator stories. So it's the answer to the question that a fan might demand. Why doesn't Superman just kill this person? Why doesn't Superman just take control? Why does blah, blah, blah? We answer that repeatedly. And it's because the reason he doesn't do that is because fascism is a moral evil, unambiguously. So, yeah.
So I also kind of feel that in the end of the stories, I think it might have been a little bit different in the book, but in the end, when you take a look at Lex Luthor being the president of the United States, he sort of was Ronald Reagan to a degree because of the fact that he basically took the United States out of what it was in the 70s. I'm talking about Ronald Reagan, and introduced his own stuff, even though there were a lot of people that disagreed with him. He turned the United States to a certain degree into one of the all great superpowers again after so many people were suffering from so much loss and depression. And I also love the fact that in the end, he resigns because he says, I've done what I needed to do. Jimmy Olsen, you're now going to be the president of the United States. And also, this is another thing, and I'm not going to say I didn't like this part, but here is roping politics, modern day politics into it. Jimmy Olsen in the movie is sort of like Barack Obama. I mean, I don't think they could have made him look more like Barack Obama. I'm being perfectly honest there. But they both had that very similar ending where Lois thinks she sees Superman with the glasses on and the trench coat, and then he's gone. And we also have that very same scene where Lex Luthor goes, Superman gone, Brainiac gone, checkmate Superman.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's very different in both places by context, though. I'm not sure if he resigns in the comic. It's kind of he's president for a long time, but his control of the United States isn't exactly dependent on being president. So it was unclear to me if he ever gave up the title.
We got into a lot more time jumps in the book.
Yeah, we did. In the movie, it's more mission accomplished. I'm now going to go do things that don't require being the president. Here you go, Jimmy. But I will say, unambiguously, the ending of the movie is so much better just because, again, on my reread, I had the same thought. Do you guys agree that the ending of the comic is hokey as all hell? Why, like, the comic ending is so stupid. I'm sorry, I don't even know how to talk about this.
No, with that last page, which is basically where we started our conversation, it's like, I think you can really make it whatever you want. I mean, I feel that when I take a look at that very final panel, to me, it basically is, and in the end, Superman was still an innocent boy that fell down to earth and got taken in by people here, just not here.
It was like a twist for a twist's sake. It was like, what? Okay, so like time is cyclical. Okay, that has nothing to do with the story we told. And on top of it, it like again, there's very little I can say about this other than the ending of the comic was stupid. I wish I could be more eloquent about this, but it makes no sense to me. But also, if that's the ending that you have to write for some reason, why in God's name does he land in Ukraine again? It seems like what you are trying to do is like, it feels like what they were supposed to do is he was going to land in the United States this time, and the implication was going to be, look how different the circumstances of one's birth can like lead to like a butterfly effect kind of thing. I also think that's stupid. I also would not have done that. But if you're going to do the time is cyclical, let's start this over thing, why in God's name do we do the same loop? I'm sorry. Stupid.
Let him land in Fiji or something like that. I don't
Yeah.
know. Let him
Something.
let him land next to a volcano in Hawaii. I don't know.
It was just so stupid, and I've got nothing else to say on the ending other than did he want to write that? Did someone tell him he had to do that? What's
I should have said let him land in Australia and be raised by dingoes. I don't know.
Yeah, more interesting. It's a different loop.
Well,
It's a different. All it needed to be was a different
given
loop.
given the way the comic started, when you're like, I don't know, not even like 2 or 3 pages in, and you have Ike talking about had it been 12 hours earlier,
Yes,
he would have landed in the United States. To me, coming full circle would have been to take that part right there and start the ending there. If we're really going to do a time warp continuum and we're going to tell the story all over again, why don't you take me back to that moment? Because I'm not stupid.
Where it came from.
Put that block of text as the narrative over that scene. Use literally those words again as the framing. And again, I think that also would have been stupid, but it would have been.
It would have made more sense.
It would have made a little more sense.
But
it should have just fucking ended.
It would have left the reader with a sense of empowerment that maybe we could kind of create our own ending, you know, kind of like a choose your own adventure story, you know, and obviously it's not written. You're just going to have to use your imagination, but it would have been a hell of a lot better than what they did at the end.
Choose your own adventure didn't work well for DC animation with the death of the family. That didn't work at all. Anyway, I think it is safe to say, as we're officially going to conclude this discussion, I think it is safe to say once again that we all agree this time that the movie is better. I'm still going to say, please read the source material because the book is a very powerful read, but this is where I appreciate when a creative team takes a great story and says, well, how are we going to make this work on film? And to a certain degree, is there a way that we could possibly make it better? Because when people always say, I love this movie, and then somebody says, well, you got to read the book, you know something? There's nothing wrong with a movie being better than its literary source material. And in this case, Superman Red Son, the film, does it so much better than the book.
Yeah, and I will say again something I mentioned at the beginning, which was I read this comic for the first time months ago. I was deeply disappointed by it. I watched the movie last night. I was very surprised by it. I reread the comic this morning. I didn't dislike it as much as the first time. I think a lot of it had to do with expectations going in. I was thinking I was about to read an all-time great Superman story, and I think what the comic is a pretty good one. I think the movie is a notably good animated film, and I went into it with such low expectations because of my takeaway from the comic. It elevated it. So this morning when I reread the comic, I had a much more favorable view on it. And I think it all has to do with the expectations you have going in. So my recommendation to people watching this is just keep an open mind. Don't expect too much. Don't expect too little. I think there are interesting themes in both to look into. You might not put this among a top 10, a top 20 of Superman stories, of comic stories, certainly. But I think there's something to enjoy here, particularly the movie version.
And I think that's what I think Cammie will agree with me. I think that because of the fact that I saw the movie first, that's why when I finished reading the comic, I said, the movie is better, but I didn't hate this book. I think that was just because of the fact that I was excited to watch the movie because of everything that I heard saying, oh, this is one of the greatest Superman stories written like in the last 20 years. I'm like, okay, DC animation, show me something. And I loved the film. I really, really did. So I think because of the fact that I loved this movie so much, I'm not going to say that my expectations for the book were through the roof, but I was anticipating a good story nonetheless. And even though, based on this conversation, yes, I think when you compare the two of them, the book has a lot more flaws. I still say the book is not bad. It's a good read.
No, no.
Well, and I go back to what I said earlier. If you're going to read the comic, start with the introduction by Tom DeSantos, because I really think his words are very important and they're very powerful to a new reader, an old reader, someone, you know, coming back in to revisit this. I will forever be on my platform to say, don't compare oranges to apples. A movie and a book should stand on their own platforms. Can they have similarities? Absolutely. Can you enjoy them both respectively and individually for what they are? Yes, 100%. But I think that this is one of those stories that does stand to say that it is one of the best Superman stories written in the last 20 years, because it took on a different perspective and a different image of Superman that we hadn't seen before. And I think what this allowed us to do as human beings is realize that Superman, despite the fact that we put him on such a high pedestal as being this red, white, and blue hero that will always save the day, what if? And that's why I love these tomorrow verses, these alternate universes that take us into these dark places. I will forever stand on my horror platform and say that more people should read more horror, because it really does a lot for this understanding of these alternate universes. So, you know, we sometimes absorb ourselves in these fictional characters that become our heroes, that are, you know, the heroes of the day. They save the world, but we can sometimes forget that they're not human. And by reading more horror, you understand that humans are innately flawed, that we want to see the good in everybody, which is great, but there is true evil in the world. And so to see Superman on the other side of the world and to understand he in fact is not human, and to see this other side of things, I will forever be on the stand that this is, despite its ending, one of my favorite Superman stories, because of the darkness that ensues, and because it allows us for us to be able to look at characters and stories and situations in such a different way. And this isn't just about Superman. This is really, I mean, we talked about a complex cast of characters. Let's look at Lois. Let's look at Batman. Let's look at, you know, all of the Green Lantern Corps. Let's look at all of these characters that were introduced within this story, and just the different sides and the different elements that we see of them here.
Well, I just want to say that this is definitely a wrap. What a great conversation that we had today. Cami, Andy, thank you so much. Cami, I have a feeling that we will revisit Superman Red Sun at some point in time, because I think one day we will definitely take a look at each of these individual stories on their own, very much like what we did to The Long Halloween. But we definitely have a lot more episodes of Who Wore It Best in store for 2023. I guess the big question is going to be, when the meeting of the minds comes together, where are we going to go next? Will we go with another DC story? Will we go with a Marvel story? Hell, we don't necessarily have to do book versus film. We could do film versus film, because one of the things that I would personally love to do one day is take a look at the very first DC animated film in the DC Universe library, which is Superman Doomsday, and compare it to the two-part film, The Death and Life of Superman. I think that would be really cool to do, because it would also be much easier to do than actually compare to the comic, just because there's so much to read. But we are going to take care of that story one day. I have a big project in mind at some point. So everybody, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.